Hi everyone, my name is Dylan Pichulik and I'm the CEO and founder of XL Real Property Management. XL Real Property Management specializes in the management of individual apartments, townhouses, and small multifamily buildings held by absentee owners. We started the company around 2012 and currently manage around $7 billion in real estate assets here in Manhattan and in Brooklyn. We're here to handle all of the affairs of the asset from rent collection, expense payment, maintenance and repair, handling insurance claims, dealing with board issues, renewal leases, anything that's entailed in the overall experience of being a landlord. Aside from managing assets that are occupied by tenants, we also handle assets that are occupied by owners themselves. We can inspect your asset in your absence. We can oversee service contracts, oversee capital repairs, ensure the bills are paid. Literally anything that's entailed in making the home ownership experience as hassle-free and stress-free as possible. We started the company with one intention: to protect the investment community here in New York City. As many of you know, ownership here in Manhattan and Brooklyn can be a complete labyrinth of protocol and other regulations we have to abide by. Rather than having to do it yourself, we're here to do that for you, making sure your assets flow as seamlessly and stress-free as possible. When we first started Excel Real Property Management 11 years ago, we did so with the intention of protecting the investment community. Here at XL Real Property Management, we focus specifically on serving the needs of individual apartments, townhouse, and small multifamily building owners both in Manhattan and select neighborhoods of Brooklyn. Our services encompass everything: rent collection, expense payment, handling maintenance and repair, turnover between tenants, insurance needs. Literally anything that an investor would typically handle him or herself, we take care of for them. Whether you hold one individual apartment or a rental building that houses 20 units, Excel is here to help with all of your specific needs. I wanted to introduce everyone to our first episode of Managing Manhattan, which is presented by XL Real Property Management and powered by the Moore Network of Brown Harris Stevens. The purpose of Managing Manhattan is to help educate the investment community about the real estate needs here in the city. We're also here to empower brokers to make smoother transactions and less stress.
This beautiful set here at Studio 1873 is brought to you by the Everset. The Everset provides full-service staging and furniture rental solutions in the New York area. We work with Brown Harris Stevens and many other top real estate firms, staging their homes to sell quickly and at the highest price possible. Our staging is affordable without sacrificing quality or design. For more information, please visit us at staging.theeverset.com or email us at staging@theeverset.com to request a free proposal.
I wanted to introduce everyone to our first guest, Debbie Riegel, who is a member of the law firm of Rosenberg and Estis. She's been in the litigation department since 1994. Debbie's been recognized as Best Lawyers, Crain's New York Business Notable Women in Law, New York Magazine's New York's Leading Lawyers, Super Lawyers, and also serves on the Brooklyn Law School Board of Trustees. Debbie, welcome to Managing Manhattan.
Thanks. Good to see you.
Perfect. For the folks at home, can you tell everyone a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I joined Rosenberg and Estis almost right out of law school in 1994. And I've been practicing real estate litigation ever since. A lot of landlord-tenant litigation and up through and including now litigation on rent regulatory issues to the Court of Appeals. And if you had asked me in 1993 when I graduated law school, I never would have imagined I would end up here, but it drives the whole economy of the city, and it's really fascinating and important.
How did you end up in landlord-tenant law? I mean, it's the wild, wild west of litigation. So what attracted you to that particular segment of law?
I wasn't really focused on it. When I graduated from law school, I was working for a very small firm that had one partner who had a lot of residential multifamily clients. And so I had done some landlord-tenant litigation for him while I was in law school. And then when the opportunity came to join Rosenberg and Estis, it was sort of a natural fit. And I really enjoy litigation. So to me, I could have litigated anything, but I had really started to learn it and enjoy it. And the firm being as good a platform as it was then and now, it just evolved.
Wow. I couldn't imagine. And hats off to you for entering that field of law. I firmly believe could be a very frustrating but rewarding experience when you get to win a case. Wow, it's a lot. So Debbie and I actually originally met way back when, probably 15 years ago. And I was working for a large developer. Debbie was handling a lot of litigation from the firm on behalf of the developer. And that's a completely different animal, even from basic landlord-tenant. What's been the most rewarding cases that you've won?
So I think from a sort of macro perspective, what I enjoy about the practice is as much the business side as the legal side, because as you know, the projects that we worked on together were hugely important from the business development side. And so understanding that piece of it and being able to fit the legal strategy into the business strategy is, sort of like my version of playing chess. But from a like pure legal, most challenging case I've handled, in 2019 when the rent laws changed, there were a series of cases, and one of them involved the Landlord, which was then undergoing its conversion to condominiums, and what evolved in the course of those cases was whether the HSTPA, which was the umbrella for all of the changes to the rent laws in 2019.
Just tell them what that stands for quick.
It's the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act.
Perfect. Great.
And it encompassed all of the changes to the rent laws that the legislature imposed in 2019. And the issue that came out of that was whether those laws could be imposed retroactively on owners, because the laws were bad enough as they were, but there was a real problem, and it would have been devastating to the real estate community had the rent laws been applied retroactively, particularly in the area of rent overcharge. So that was probably the hardest case I handled, and went to the Court of Appeals, and probably the most rewarding because at the end of the argument, in a political climate that wasn't terribly friendly to owners right then, at the end of the argument, I walked out and I looked at my colleague who had come to Albany with me, and I said, I think we just won. And we did. And it was real. And that was the Regina Metropolitan case, which really saved investors and developers from massive liability for retroactive rent overcharge.
So we have you to thank for protecting all of these owners from having retroactive rent charges for the laws that passed in 2019. You should get like a statue outside of City Hall.
Me and a big team.
In my opinion. I also remember a very interesting case we worked on through the developer I worked for, where the developer had bought a building on the Upper East Side. We thought we were okay with all the leases, and then at the last minute, it turns out there was a woman living in the storage room right next to the roof, and not only was the apartment, which wasn't actually an apartment, about maybe 200 square feet at the most, she was living with 13 cats.
Yes.
And that was a very unfortunate story for the developer, because I remember he had to make her a very large payout, several $1 million from what I recall, in order to get her out so we could continue on with the development of the building. And I still think of that story and showing up to that storage room who someone was living in for I don't know how long.
For a long time.
And had 13 cats as roommates.
I remember the moment my process server came back and said that he had served her personally. And I said, what do you mean you served her personally? No one's supposed to be there. It's a storage room. Yeah. But those are like that's not an atypical New York story, right? People live everywhere, and it's kind of what makes the practice interesting, because you never know what you're going to find.
Oh, you never know in this town. You definitely
like,
never know.
It's like the time I went to court with a tenant who was like this lovely man who was living in a YMCA. And I was a very young attorney, and he came into court and he said to me, "It's okay, I'm going to be able to pay my rent. I have a big check coming." And I was like, great. I couldn't have been happier. I wanted to adopt this man. And he hands me, and I'm going to say this, and there are people who are not going to know what I'm talking about, and I just realized I'm dating myself, but he hands me the envelope he had just gotten from Publishers Clearinghouse, telling him he had won $10 million.
Wow.
And my face dropped, because I didn't know how to explain to this man that there was not money coming. And then we went and got in front of a judge who he said the same thing to, and I saw her face do the same thing that mine did. And it was one of those moments where I was like, I'm almost playing social worker right now.
Yeah. Where do you even go with that? Go with that? So, Debbie, a big part of our audience is actually the real estate brokerage community. And for the topic of this podcast, we want to focus on how do we protect owners in the case of the landlord-tenancy relationship. Typically, the real estate broker is the one who starts off the relationship with the tenant. They're the first face you interact with, the first voice you hear. What can the real estate brokerage community do to help start the relationship on the right foot?
So I think the building blocks are all communication, and that starts with the broker, and that continues with the owner and the leasing agent and the managing agent. But look, there's a fine line that brokers have to walk between renting an apartment or selling an apartment and playing that role, but also not overselling such that the tenant can come back and say that something was misrepresented to them. And it's a hard line to walk, but it really is very much initially about the communication and about knowing what the owner's rights are and what the broker can and can't do. For instance, look, nobody wants to rent to a tenant who's going to default on paying their rent. Making sure that you have a credit-worthy tenant, but also being conscious of some of the pitfalls that go along with that. For instance, one of the changes that was made to the rent laws is that owners can no longer review housing court history to determine if a tenant is creditworthy. Now, it's counterintuitive. You would want to know, from a logical perspective, you would want to know if the tenant you're renting to was evicted for non-payment of rent right before applying for your apartment. But, the first step and the first sort of line of defense here is the broker. And if the broker missteps with respect to that particular issue, it has the potential for cascading. So I think, for the brokers, it's know what you can and can't do, communicate clearly. Look, I had a tenant in a co-op subject to board approval who needed to move out of his apartment, didn't understand, and I don't think it was that the broker didn't communicate it properly, but didn't understand that there was going to be a delay waiting for board approval, and got the approval 2 days before the lease was supposed to start and said, well, I can't move anymore because I couldn't wait, so I made other arrangements. So it's those kinds of, pieces of effective communication that will make the process move smoothly, and protect your client, protect the owner.
We get a call like that every day. I actually just spoke to a woman yesterday. She was renting an apartment. We had a whole call actually with the broker 2 weeks ago when she applied and said, hey, she has to be in by January 1st. And I explained we'd absolutely love for that to happen. We can't guarantee it. We need to get the board application in quickly so that we can get it done as quickly as possible. But keep in mind, we're going into the holidays. As you know, New Yorkers love to run away from the city as often as we can to keep our sanity and recharge from all the chaos that you face here. And we said, look, it's the holidays. I can't guarantee it'll happen. Everybody's going to be distracted. She said, okay, no problem. Let's do our best. So then yesterday I get a call from the tenant who's screaming mad, or spitting mad rather, saying, I was promised I'd be in not only January 1st, but earlier than January 1st, which I don't know where the earlier date came from. And she said, my broker promised me I was going to be in by December 27th. And I said, well, the broker has no control over this. I didn't want to throw the broker under the bus, but I'm thinking back in my head, we had a whole call trying to avoid this because I didn't want to start the relationship off poorly because you felt like nobody was being upfront with you about what the actual process would be. So I felt bad for the tenant, but there's nothing we can do. And they're like, well, put me in under a guest pass. It's like, we don't want to start our relationship off lying to the board. That's not going to get us anywhere we're going to be.
What do you really need to know about buying or selling a home? First, it's serious business, and it's complicated. There's a lot of money on the table, and emotion too. You need an agent who knows the ropes. So, whether you're buying or selling your home, work with professionals who have a mastery of the craft.
So you mentioned there's things that we can legally check and there are things we can't check. What are the things that landlords can legally look at when considering whether or not a tenant's qualified to rent the apartment?
So assuming that you get authorization to run a credit check, you're still permitted to run credit checks. And look, they're going to tell you probably 90% of what you need to know. Somebody who has a history of late payments on their credit cards, probably not a good credit risk, and that's still fair game. And so sort of the traditional credit reports are fine. And where you run potentially afoul of housing discrimination laws, or where you get to housing court history and criminal history. It seems counterintuitive not to be able to run somebody's criminal history to know if they have an assault conviction, but it's what the law is. So
has that law passed yet that
yes.
you can no longer check criminal history?
So what I generally advise clients, there are certain categories of criminal convictions that you are permitted to base your determination on. But what I generally advise clients is don't run the criminal background check until you are otherwise satisfied with the tenant.
Right.
If they pass all your other credit checks, then maybe you want to look at the criminal background. Some clients don't even look anymore.
But you're allowed to look at the criminal, you're not allowed, I know you're not allowed to look at the landlord-tenant history, but you are allowed to look at the criminal background?
You can look, but you can't make you can't make a rental determination
based on their
criminal history.
Unless it's something like a sex offender or something of that nature.
So, but the problem becomes, once you look at it, you run the risk that the tenant will claim that your determination was pretextual.
Based on their
criminal history. So generally speaking, I have clients who either don't look at all because they don't want to take the risk of a fair housing claim, or clients who don't look until they've otherwise made that decision, so that they can say, if there's a rejection, if you're rejecting because of a bad credit report, you can say, I didn't look at the criminal history.
Right.
And if you otherwise pass credit, and you look at the criminal history and there is a conviction based on which you're entitled to reject the application, then you can isolate that. But it's tricky. And the last place most owners want to end up is before the city or the state Human Rights Commission, because then you're in a whole other category of pain.
Just the legal fees alone on the defense.
The legal fees on the defense, the potential fines, the training that you end up having to agree to, and depending on the nature of the claim, it can affect your whole portfolio. So it's a tricky area, and an ounce of prevention.
I agree. And I want to second Debbie's comment about the credit report. I think credit report is probably the single-handed most important factor in determining whether or not a tenant is creditworthy.
Mm-hmm.
It's our official report card of whether or not you pay your bills on time. If you're not paying MasterCard and you're not paying Toyota and you're not paying, Con Ed or the doctor,
chances are you're
probably not going to pay the landlord. So in every case, I advise that every broker, every owner, we need to make sure that not only are you checking the credit, but you're checking it yourself. I hate it when people accept these, the credit score from the computer, from your credit card company. There's no name on it. The tenant had the opportunity to not, manufacture whatever score he wants. So always run it yourself. And there's also a big misnomer out there that I find a lot between owners and brokers of how the either condo board or co-op board is going to qualify the tenant.
Mm-hmm.
Co-ops obviously have a lot more power to decide whether or not they want to accept the tenant. So I'm sure they use the credit score as a basis for their acceptance. In a lot of cases, most condos only have right of first refusal. Right. As long as you give them every lick of paperwork they've requested, that telephone book board package that we have to submit every time we put a rental tenant in, then the condo doesn't care what the credit is. The condo has no basis to make a rejection based on the credit score. So always run it and never rely on the condo board, especially to help you qualify their tenant. I've gotten one call in about 13 years from a management company that looked at the overall tenant credentials, and they called me and they said, Dylan, are you sure you want this tenant? And I said, yeah, I'm sure. I never saw the board package. It doesn't go through Excel. It goes to the broker. I'm like, why? They're like, oh, well, he just got out of prison a week ago for cocaine trafficking. He was in for 15 years. I was like, oh, okay. And he has a 580 credit score. And I'm like, okay. Let me call the broker and see what's going on here. Right. But, in that case, luckily the tenant decided he didn't want the apartment anymore and was probably...
and you were lucky that the managing agent for the building actually looked at it.
Yeah, but even if they do, what power do I have? I have a countersigned lease.
Right.
Luckily it took a long time to process the paperwork, and the tenant ended up going somewhere else or was reincarcerated, whatever. But they don't call you. They can't call you. They're not going to share their credit report. So always do it yourself to make sure that we don't have any problems.
Yes, because in a weird way, it's easier not to pay your landlord sometimes than not to pay MasterCard.
Oh, yeah, Visa, absolutely.
Because they'll sue you fast.
Yeah.
And, with the delays in housing court, sometimes it's easier to delay paying your landlord than it is to delay paying your credit cards.
Oh, absolutely. Especially post-COVID. I mean, it started with the whole, there was no housing court during the actual pandemic, and then there was a huge backlog. Are they through the backlog yet?
They are through the backlog. It is slow. It depends on the borough. Some are slower than others. The glimmer of hope here is that the legislature did add 5 new housing court judges to the bench.
Oh, okay.
There are 5 more judges now than there were pre-COVID. It has lightened the caseload a little bit. And some of the changes, again, a little counterintuitive, but some of the changes in the law have lightened the caseload in housing court for good cause eviction. And I don't think we're totally seeing the effect yet, but good cause eviction, which gives even market tenants now rights of renewal, has and will continue to eliminate lease expiration holdovers, no cause holdovers, because there's no such thing anymore.
Right.
You're required to offer a renewal lease even to a market tenant now. So it hopefully will have the effect of lessening the caseload in housing court and reducing the number of filings, which hopefully will allow the expanded bench to move through their cases a little more quickly. But it's going to take a little bit of time for us, I think, to see that.
No, I hope to see that happen. I remember we had to do an eviction case maybe 6 months or 8 months ago. And we were there, I think, in early November we were finally going to trial. We walk in, we're ready for trial. Our lawyer has, a whole cart full of files. And the judge looks up, he's like, I didn't know we were doing the trial today. It's like, no, we're definitely on the calendar. He's like, yeah. And he gave some lame excuse, like, I have a headache, or something like that. You'll have to come back. We're like, okay, well, we're here. Can we do it? No, you've got to come back. What's the next date? And they're like, May 5th. Like 6 months, the tenant already owed us like $170,000, and they're saying come back in 6 months. So I'm happy to see that the backlog is cleared. What is something landlords can do to protect themselves against, these, a tenant relationship that had gone sideways? Is there anything we can do other than checking credit? And
so, I teach a landlord tenant course at Brooklyn Law School. And I spend actually more than a full class on your lease form, because it's the basis of the relationship. Everything goes back to the lease. And the number of times I've had to say to a client, I can't evict your tenant for some behavioral default, objectionable conduct kind of default. It's not in your lease. So it's, reflexively, a lot of owners, particularly small owners, will use either a Blumberg form or the Rebney form. And they're good forms. I mean, most of what you need is in there. But when you're renting, a luxury apartment, you're renting a co-op or a condo or, just a high rent unit, a little more attention to the lease, a little more attention to, what's in your form. And look, you create it once, right? It's not like you have to recreate your lease every time you have a tenant, but it all starts with the lease and knowing that you're protected and thinking about things like, do I want to potentially have liability to a tenant for attorney's fees? Because statutorily, if a landlord has a right to recover attorney's fees under their lease, then the tenant has a statutory reciprocal right. I have a number of clients who've just taken the attorney's fees provision out of their lease because they would rather absorb that cost as part of their cost of doing business than risk. They go into a case, there is some legal aid attorney or legal services attorney who comes up with a creative argument that costs thousands of dollars to litigate, and then not only potentially do you lose, but you end up having to pay legal services their fees. So thinking about what your risk tolerance is and thinking about whether, like in that particular instance, whether you would rather forego your claim for attorney's fees than risk having to pay it to a tenant. Making sure if you've got a stabilized unit, making sure you look at the rent history before you rent it, and that you don't have any holes in your rental history and you don't have any potential overcharge claims.
And that you're also using the correct lease form. Oftentimes people are seeing, using rent stabilized lease forms for a market apartment and vice versa. Yes. I also see the same thing you probably see of they're not filling out the lease properly. They're not including all of the detail that should be included in it. Yeah. Everything in a landlord-tenant relationship should be in writing so that we have a basis. Otherwise, it comes down to a he said, she said. Correct. Nobody wins that. And then the last thing I would mention is putting down, I think it's Exhibit A on the new Rebney lease. I personally hate the Bloomberg. I don't think it's as reflective of New York City or New York State housing laws. I'd rather use a Rebney. But there's a whole, I think Exhibit A, where you can list out all the work that you're going to be doing in the apartment for turnover, because we don't want the tenant moving in feeling bamboozled or misled that the apartment wasn't whatever they were expecting to happen.
The broker told me you were going to replace the dishwasher.
Yeah, you were going to replace the dishwasher. You were going to refinish the floors. And also, I think even taking it a step further, if you know something is broken in the apartment and you have no intention of fixing it, just because you don't care about it doesn't mean the next tenant won't care about it either. Some people care about nothing. Some people care about everything. So I'd even go as far and correct me if I'm wrong, can you do this? List what will be broken in the apartment that you're not going to fix. Can you do that?
Well, so it depends, right? Because if it rises to a breach of warranty of habitability, then you have to fix it no matter what.
Right.
You can't carve yourself out of it.
That I agree, but what about something we get time and time again is the AV system. Somebody spent a fortune building this, AV system. Now 10 years has gone by,
and it's obsolete.
Obsolete.
And it doesn't work.
The owner doesn't. Can you put?
Yes,
do you have to fix that, or can you put in the lease? This will not be working when you move in.
So look, what the warranty of habitability says is the owner is responsible for correcting conditions that are dangerous to life, health, and safety.
Like heat, hot water.
Right. Now, has that been expanded in the course of litigation in housing court to things that I think are beyond life, health, and safety? Sure. You have tenants complain about, their wood floors not being finished nicely. And, some judge will likely say that, that should be repaired. Distinct from you've got a floorboard that's loose and it's a trip hazard. But something that is purely aesthetic, or something that is purely what you would characterize as like a luxury service. You shouldn't get tripped up on warranty of habitability, but you could get tripped up on a contractual basis, because if they rent the apartment thinking there's an AV system and it turns out it doesn't work. So it goes back to what I said originally. It's all about communication.
Right.
And whether that's oral communication or that's communication in the lease, you're 100% right. If there's, if you've got speakers in the ceiling and they're not connected to anything, a tenant walking in and touring that apartment is going to think that they have surround sound.
Right.
So it's all about setting expectations and telling them what they're going to have. If there's, if you've got through the wall air conditioning, and the air conditioning units don't work, and you want the tenant to be responsible for that, you've got to tell them that. You've got to provide heat. As of now, you don't have to provide air conditioning.
But they're talking about changing that, right?
I was going to say there is a draft of a bill that would require owners to provide air conditioning. Where that goes, we'll see. But at the moment, you don't have to provide air conditioning, but it's the same thing. If a tenant tours a unit and sees either window units or through the wall units, they're going to assume that there is air conditioning unless you tell them there's not. So, I have a colleague who frequently will say, measure twice, cut once. Like, make sure before you put the tenant into possession that everything that you expect to provide, or that they might expect you to provide, is in the lease. And the best place to put it is in that exhibit to the lease, or create a rider yourself.
Yeah, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. Right. There's no dispute later.
Right.
Now, back in 2019, they did these lovely rent changes, which all of us landlords love. And, they did a complete overhaul of all the rent laws. A lot of those have been challenged in court. A lot of them were, in my opinion, totally asinine and misguided. And I don't know how the bill got signed in the first place. I still don't get it. Are there any potential rollbacks of some of these particular laws? Because some are just not benefiting anyone. They're hurting both sides. And I know there was a lot of, challenges. Some even went to Supreme Court. Is there any hope on the horizon that some laws could be rolled back? And I'm talking more on the free market side. Stabilized is a whole other animal, which we can get to later, because they basically took an asset that was worth 30 to 75, 80 cents on the dollar, made it effectively worth zero in a lot of cases. But what about the free market thing?
Many of the changes on the free market side were more sort of procedural in nature. It was about notices, and it was about the changes in security deposit. I don't really see any changes coming. Now, it's always possible that I look, every election cycle we say, well, maybe the Republicans will take back the state Senate. And if they do, maybe there's more sort of horse trading like there was before the HSTPA. But I think, and you probably feel it more than I do, it feels like the industry has adjusted to a lot of those changes. Look, the 5-day notice, the reminder notices about rent, which I personally think are a little infantilizing. Tenants know if they haven't paid rent. They don't need a 5-day notice that says you haven't paid your rent and we're reminding you before we sue you. But it feels like the industry has sort of adjusted to them and built them into their routine. The same thing with the notices of non-renewal. They're aggravating. They're a little more, they're a little more of a time suck. Sometimes they're a little more legal work because, there are times that clients come to me when the lease has expired and they haven't served the 30, 60, or 90-day notice. And I have to say to them, well, we have to first serve that notice. But it does feel in some ways that the industry has adjusted to it. The bigger, because it's an economic issue, the bigger issue seems to me to be the inability to take more than a month of security.
Right.
I think it's, it was almost immediately cleaned up with respect to co-ops and condos. It made no sense to apply to co-ops because co-ops regularly make the decision that they will approve a purchase application because technically that's a landlord-tenant relationship too, because it's a proprietary lease. And co-ops routinely make the decision that, a potential shareholder who might be on the margin economically can be approved if they'll provide a maintenance deposit.
Right.
But maintenance deposits are technically security deposits.
Right.
So that was cleaned up relatively quickly.
So in a co-op, you can collect more security?
In a co-op, you can collect more than a month.
Oh.
Because it took a little bit to sort of, to explain it, explain why it was important to carve out co-ops. But on co-ops now, you can take your maintenance deposit. So you can take your maintenance escrows.
What about condos? Can you take more security deposit on a condo?
Well, so in a condo where you're a condo owner renting to a tenant, you can't.
You can't do it. So just in a co-op situation.
So it's really in a co-op situation.
And I'll end with one final question, because it's something that I get every day since we have a lot of brokers that are watching this as well as owners. This whole advanced rent thing, we can't collect more than 1 month rent and 1 month security. I think that's been one of the biggest detrimental things to making it actually much harder for a tenant to get an apartment. Yeah. And we oftentimes have tenants saying, I want to pay the year up front. Whatever their circumstance are, they don't want to be reminded of monthly rent payments. They got a big settlement, whatever if the tenant voluntarily and without you provoking them to do it, but says, hey, I want to pay my lease up front, are you allowed to take it?
So talk to me in maybe 2 months. I'm actually litigating that question right now.
Okay, good.
Where a tenant signed an escrow agreement that says right on its face that he was paying the rent for a full year upfront at his request, and has now not vacated. And part of his defense is that the owner took the year upfront. I don't know the answer to the question. I know what I think the answer should be. That it's one thing for an owner not to be able to ask for it. It's another thing if a tenant says to you, I need to pay this up front. And in particular, where it becomes an issue is international students.
Exactly. International students. It's a big one because
they don't have assets here. You can't. So your only recourse is going to be to evict. You're not, and they probably don't have a guarantor that's in the States either.
Or we make you sign up for guarantors or one of these
Right.
other programs, but
Right.
they're expensive. They
Right.
cost a month of rent, and it also complicates collection because now, as a landlord, if I have the money in my account,
Right.
I've got the money in my account. I don't have to
Right.
worry. When I've got to go through a third-party service,
Right.
it becomes questionable if I'm actually
Right.
going to see that money.
Right.
So no, I want to follow up with you on that in 2 months because that's a
Yeah.
question I get a lot. Unfortunately, we're out of time for today. Thank everyone for joining us on Managing Manhattan, and we'll see you next time.